because we would like to kind of have a idea of what is being collected right now, and in the next, let's say, 5 years or maybe 10 years, I don't know what the time spans are of your acquisition policies, in these European museums, ethnographic museums or world culture museums, because we were wondering if we're all kind of like doing the same thing, or is there very different things being done. We heard briefly yesterday also from Marseille that there's a huge amount of collecting going on in your institute, and others yesterday evening were saying, but we don't have an acquisition plan as such. We just collect differently. So we thought it might be interesting to see how, and if there might be an interest to kind of exchanging our experiences with drafting acquisition plans, and also, this is working, yeah? In drafting acquisition plans, and I would like to start with the process that we've gone through, just in our case, after the merger. We all had our own acquisition plans, collection planning that we had done, and when we became one institute and actually had joined all our collections, we decided that we also needed a new acquisition plan, because we all had our own tendencies, both Leiden, Bergendal, and Amsterdam. We all had our own foci, let's say, our own strategic points that we collected on. So what we decided to do, and it's written in Dutch, so parts I didn't bother to completely transform it all into English, but we decided to first say, okay, why do we collect? And so we kind of wrote this with, who we had in mind was actually our stakeholders from the government mainly. So it's mainly our government stakeholders. We sat together with all the curators for 3 days and had a meeting where we were actually discussing what should ethnographic museums acquire, what have we been acquiring. We were guided by somebody who led the process, and we came to a certain amount of statements on why we collect and what are the principles for active and passive collecting. Passive collecting meaning when donations come in, what is it that we collect? And also about deacquisitioning. So if we're deacquisitioning, what would that mean to us and how could it be done? This is because this is a very important matter in our case in the Netherlands, because some of the museums in the Netherlands, during past directors who luckily now have stepped down as directors. In Rotterdam, for example, there was a huge plan to do deaccessioning for almost 80 to 90% of the collection. So that was a big focus for us as an institution. Also because some of our own boards members were thinking as deaccessioning as a very important thing to do. Once you've merged your collections, probably there must be so much overlap. Could you tell us how much overlap there is and how much we can count on you deaccessioning? So this part I have translated, but we will be translating these, our whole acquisition plan, which is about 20 pages or something, where we kind of exemplify and explain which choices we made and why. Our plan tells how in the coming policy period cultural dynamics will come to the fore. And culture is, we kind of discussed how culture is constantly changing. Our collections show that movement, the flux of people, the flux of ideas, and that's what it always has shown. And encounters between people and culture, cultures provide cultural exchange. They provide mixing, but also friction, conflict, struggles, resistance is all to be read from within our collections. And one of the good examples, and our curator just arrived here from the 60s exhibit, there's Miriam Shatanawi, is where looking at the 60s as a worldwide happening, what was happening throughout the world during certain periods of time, are these kind of, it actually uses objects from all through all the regional divides and all through the material divides, you could say, that are within our database systems, and also within the way that curators are positioned as taking a place within the organization. But out of a sharper focus on cultural movement, on cultural dynamics, followed a renewed interest in specific collections that bear witness to this interculturalism, to these kind of contacts and changes. And so they can tell a story about international relations, power relations, globalization, migration, and all those topics are also going to be worked out in our research center. So the research center has an agenda which actually focuses on many of those themes, actually. We also work towards new conceptual, to working in a framework of assessing significance in our collection. So we've reassessed our collections. We're in the process of reassessing our collections completely through a program which is actually inspired by the process that Australia went through, which is called Significance 2.0, and they also do this process of or a framework for assessing significance. And we have said the old division between Western and non-Western culture and art has lost its validity in the 21st century. It never really had a validity, actually. But we did use it a lot, and we did actually work from that. And once you start looking at cultural dynamics of today, of our or of earlier times, such a strict division no longer fits. So it's an imagined dichotomy anyways. And what we wanted to do is see if we could look at our collections from a different point of view and actually also see if the significance of our collections can also be looked at from a different point of view. So what we start out of is that we have a collection which has an unsurpassed versatility, unprecedented rich narratives that it can tell, actually, those collections, and that they tell all kinds of stories, either individually or as ensembles. They tell all kinds of stories of connectivity, on belonging, on identity, all those kind of aspects are discussed. And more than any cultural institution also in the Netherlands, we feel that our collections give us a possibility to connect with different stakeholders from all over the globe, but also different stakeholders here in the Netherlands. And as we've discussed earlier in many of the case studies, so far some of our institutions have actually worked a lot with indigenous stakeholders from afar, like Australia, New Zealand, Greenland, Brazil, and Suriname. But we have and will also keep seeking in the next policy period a lot of collaboration with diverse individuals and groups in the Netherlands, such as our Islamic art and Islamic visual culture collections. We'll be working a lot with people who are living here and who are actually going to, we hope, give lots of opportunity to establish relationships and establish partnerships with people from both close by and afar. So we also try to work in a quest for more inclusive ways to work with stakeholder groups. So co-creation has been one of these experiments that we've told about a little bit yesterday, but we'll probably we'll talk about in Marseille maybe later again. And so we kind of say, okay, there's this endless amount of inventiveness, tradition also, innovation that the objects speak about. How can we make sure that there's room for this studying these archives of creativity, of human creativity, of how they shape your world? Also, should we not, in the next few years, rethink certain topics? And this is a photo which is not from our museum, an object in our museum, but an object in Sweden. So we were inspired also by the way that in the Fetish modernity exhibit from the RIM project, there was this idea was actually posed in many of the, in a part of the exhibit. I assume most of you have seen the exhibit, where we wanted to question the definitions, the current definitions and the current frameworks and understandings and appreciation of certain concepts such as design, fashion, art. Why are certain objects called design and other objects are just called crafts? Why are certain objects called dress, certain costumes called dress and others fashion? And who decides and who should define that? So those are going to be the next, for our museums, we think that our collections are actually a ground for taking those discussions much further and questioning those kind of frameworks, let's say. Our focus on world cultures and this contemporary experience of culture requires a shift of attention to a more a different perspective. So what we choose to do is for our new acquisitions to actually say, if we want to achieve our mission and broaden perspectives, let's say, and look for more empathic ways of understanding each other, we need to look at our collections, and in some ways a collection will do. In other stuff, we just have representations of very one-sided representations of issues such as colonialism, for example, in our collections. And we need to make, if we want to address certain topics, we need to make new additions to our collections. And we've made a couple of strategic choices of where we will be profiling ourselves, and those are the 5 topics that we want to work on, which is the popular, fashion, design, and contemporary art, and photography. Those are the ones that we really are going to try and both question, what do they mean, what does it mean in the global context, what does it mean in the context here in the Netherlands also, so also take into account the regionality of those questions. And then another part that we're also going to keep on doing is maintain and add to our historical collections when financially possible. But we will be putting the main focus on on those strategic choices that we made, where we think we need to catch up also, that we haven't really given enough attention to. In this case, we also decided to keep on, most of the curators actually chose to keep looking for the most important parts of our collections, where we really have collections that stand out for the historical collections. And we chose to also define what are we going to be collecting actively still in our historical collections, and what are we passively going to receive still. We have a whole way of how this works within. These are some of the objects that we're also not just making new acquisitions, but also looking at our collections through new lenses and seeing that some of the stuff that we've collected actually is already representing issues of fashion and design. And so there are already objects that actually will be able to be looked at through new lenses, but this is kind of what we're going to be focusing on, and also questioning a lot, because we aren't there yet. If anyone's interested in the Dutch version of our plan, I do have it here and I can send it to you. And maybe Google Translate will already give you some ideas of what it's about. But we will be translating this also once we have our whole collection management profile, or our whole collection policy, which is much broader and doesn't just go into acquisitioning, but goes into everything that we intend to do when it concerns collection, also collection management, the collection mobility, etc. And what I was hoping from this session is that we might also have a discussion on, would there be a relevance to seeing how our European agendas of acquisitioning could be connected, and is there something to say to see if we should also, with museums who are presently collecting, if we are collecting global fashion, does everybody need to collect global fashion, or is there a way that we could actually, thinking of collection mobility, know that if you are collecting the economy of waste, then there's no need for us to also concentrate on those aspects, or are there aspects which are really regionally so grounded that you need to actually collect them in the areas where your museum is positioned, because they'll tell stories about how you